Thinking about being mentally healthy in early childhood is easier when done in the context of risk and protective factors. The Kids Matter framework is based on risk and protective factors that assist us in understanding the different influences on children's mental health. Risk and protective factors can be identified in relation to an individual's skills, needs and temperament, family circumstances and relationships. Risk and protective factors can also include specific life events and the social environment.
So risk and protective factors are kind of always interacting at any time and in any kid and in any family. And certainly the foundation for protective factors and this notion of tolerating difficulty. So how kids manage risk factors or manage psychological insults, it could be grief, they could be loss, they could be whatever they are, is sort of mediated through a lot of factors. One of them is just how stable their relationships are. One of those factors is how significant and confident they are in their relationships. And one of those factors is how significant and reliable and trustworthy they are within those relationships. So that kids need a very strong sense of security. And in the context of that, they can usually manage a surprising array of stressors, and they get that security really base one, in their intimate relationships with their mum or their dad or other significant adults who are really a critical part of their lives. And that can include extended family members, it can include early childhood educators. And that's the kind of the spring, the source, the kind of spring well from which kids can manage to negotiate much of the risks and difficulties that they face. So that's probably an important part of how protective factors can operate, because what that security does, it allows adaptability. So one of the things that secure relationships encourages is kids to experiment with different ways of doing things or different ways of being. And that's a very kind of unique capacity. We talk about how adults or how services and how organisations can innovate. Innovation for adults is a bit like play for kids. It's about how kids learn to be adaptable and respond to different situations. And that really relies on having very secure relationships.
Well, I think the risk factors for infants and young children start in utero. And unfortunately, that children have so little control over what happens to them and around them, and this is why as parents and as early childhood educators we have such a lot of responsibility. There are some experiences in utero that can make it harder or make children more likely to be unsettled as infants. And in infancy and early childhood you really can't separate physical health from social and emotional health and well-being. And so sometimes, a baby who has been born prematurely or who is sick and struggling with something like, a chronic illness or an acute episode, they're more likely to be more unsettled. They might have more difficulty feeding, they might have more difficulty setting up sleep and settling routines with their caregiver, and all of that means that the people looking after that baby have to be extra attuned and extra sensitive. So, and obviously there are some other risks that you really hope children aren't exposed to, but that includes exposure to drugs, both particularly illicit drugs and alcohol in utero, which also I think there's some increasing evidence that can again make children more irritable or impact on their neurological and cognitive development later on. But once the baby is born, I think the emphasis has to be on them having a good, stable set of relationships with and people around them. So if the family is very stressed, I think that inevitably impacts on the baby. And sometimes that's very practical things, like a family who are really struggling with where they live or living in circumstances that are fairly chaotic or a lot of other people are around. And I think if parents are struggling themselves with either the practical things or with their own mental health or their own physical health as well, that can make it much harder for them to give priority to their baby's needs.
Kids Matter Early Childhood focuses on enhancing the protective factors that strengthen children's resilience. Kids Matter concentrates on strengthening these protective factors within the early childhood setting. This in turn promotes resilience and helps to reduce the impact of any risk factors and stressful life events on children. It should be noted that the presence of risk factors does not mean a child will experience mental health difficulties. However, when multiple risk factors are present, this likelihood is significantly increased. There are a number of risk and protective factors that impact children's mental health and well-being. Recognising children who have mental health risk factors in their lives and providing them with support to build on the protective factors may prevent them from having mental health difficulties later in life.